Today we will explore one of the greatest distortions that the popular imagination has constructed about the Middle Ages. The idea that knights were prisoners inside their own armor, metal creatures so heavy and inflexible that they could hardly move without outside help. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. For centuries, the image of the medieval knight has been etched into the collective imagination in a very specific way. A man enclosed within a rigid metal construction, so heavy and inflexible that the help of servants and even elaborate mechanisms would be necessary for him to mount his horse. This image, reproduced in films, television series, and historical novels, has become almost a cultural axiom, a truth that no one thought to question because it seemed at first glance completely logical. After all, steel is a heavy material. Armor that covers the entire body must therefore be an enormous burden. And a warrior carrying so much weight would certainly have his mobility severely compromised. But this logic, as seductive as it may seem, is deeply flawed. And history, when examined closely, tells a completely different narrative. To understand the truth about medieval armor, one must first understand the world that created it. Medieval Europe was not a place of peace and stability. It was a continent in constant motion, where kingdoms rose and fell, where borders were redrawn by battles and treaties, where a man's ability to defend himself and to attack determined not only his survival, but his social status, his wealth, and his destiny. In this context, armor was not a decorative symbol, nor was it a piece of empty ostentation. It was a vital necessity, and as such it was treated with the highest technical rigor that the era allowed. The early warriors of the early Middle Ages protected themselves with whatever they had available. Hardened leather, shirts of metal links, what we know today as chainmail, wooden shields reinforced with metal, and simple forged iron helmets made up the protective arsenal of most combatants between the 5th and 10th centuries. These protections were relatively accessible compared to what would come later, but they offered limited safety against sword strokes, spear points, and the projectiles of arrows fired from a powerful bow. Chainmail was, in this early period, the most sophisticated solution available for body protection. Woven by skilled artisans from hundreds of small, interconnected metal rings, it enveloped the warrior like a second skin of iron. Its flexibility was one of its main attributes. Unlike a rigid metal plate, chainmail adapted to the movement of the body, allowing the warrior to run, crouch, raise his arms, and swing his sword with relative freedom. But it had evident limitations. Against a very sharp point applied with sufficient force, or against the blunt impact of a war mace or a hammer, chainmail offered protection that left much to be desired, especially as combat tactics evolved. It was from these concrete limitations that the art of armor began its evolutionary journey. And this evolution, which spanned several centuries with a slowness that reflected both technological obstacles and the creative persistence of the artisans involved, is one of the most fascinating stories of human engineering in the Middle Ages. Between the 11th and 12th centuries, European artisans began experimenting with metal plates that could be fixed over the chainmail at specific points on the body, the most vulnerable areas such as knees, elbows, and shoulders. These first plates were relatively simple, often made of hardened leather covered by metal sheets, and served as additional reinforcement on top of the protection already offered by the mail. It was a hybrid solution, a transitional stage that reflected both the creativity of the artisans and the technological and economic limitations of the time. As the decades passed, accumulated learning and the progressive improvement of metallurgical techniques allowed for increasingly significant advances. The plates became larger, more precise in their contours, and more integrated with one another. Artisans discovered that it was possible to create sets of metal pieces that fitted together and articulated in ingenious ways, covering the body without immobilizing it. Each joint, each point where two plates met and where protection needed to coexist with movement, became an engineering challenge that European master armorers dedicated themselves to solving with growing mastery and a creativity that today surprises researchers accustomed to modern design tools. By around the 14th century, something extraordinary had emerged from these decades of experimentation and refinement. Full-plate armor, sometimes called Gothic armor, in its most elegant and refined form, represented the pinnacle of the technology available at that time. It was an integrated system of protection that covered the warrior from head to toe with metal pieces carefully shaped and articulated with each other. The helmet, the gorget protecting the neck, the spolders guarding the shoulders, the breastplate and backplate forming a protective shell around the torso, the vambraces, the articulated gauntlets, the cuishes, the polins, the greaves, and the sabatons enveloping the knight's feet to the tip. Each of these pieces was designed not only to protect individually, but to function in harmony with all the others, like a living and integrated system. And here we come to the heart of the misconception that the popular imagination has perpetuated for so long. Because what historians, military history specialists, and curators of the world's largest armor museums confirm, based on decades of study and direct analysis of original pieces, is that a full suit of plate armor for a typical medieval knight generally weighed between 15 and 25 kilograms. In extreme cases, such as armor created specifically for tournaments, formal competitions where protection was maximized because combatants did not need to move with the same agility as in a real battle, this weight could reach 30 or even 35 kilograms. But field armor, that used in real combat where life depended as much on protection as on the ability to move, was designed with special care to balance these two fundamental imperatives. 15 to 25 kilograms may still seem like a lot, but it is essential to put this number into historical and contemporary perspective. A modern infantry soldier, carrying his full combat gear, ballistic vest, ballistic helmet, ammunition, field radio, water and food supplies, and his primary weapon, frequently carries between 40 and 60 kilograms of equipment. An active-duty firefighter, equipped with his full protective suit, can carry more than 20 kilograms in clothing alone before picking up any work tool. And no one suggests that modern firefighters are incapable of moving efficiently. But there is a crucial difference that goes far beyond total weight, how that weight is distributed across the wearer's body. And it is exactly at this point that medieval armor reveals one of its dimensions that is least recognized publicly but most admired among specialists. A heavy backpack concentrates almost all its weight on the back and shoulders, creating postural imbalance and specific, accumulated fatigue in those regions. A modern ballistic vest, likewise, distributes its weight in a way that can be reasonably efficient, but still overloads the torso disproportionately. A suit of medieval plate armor, well fitted to the warrior's body, on the other hand, distributed its weight across the entire body surface: shoulders, torso, hips, legs, and even feet. The different pieces worked together, transferring the load gradually and balancedly, in a way that modern ergonomics researchers, when studying these creations, describe with an admiration that often surprises them. This does not mean that carrying armor was like walking around weightless. The physical effort required was real and considerable, but it was an effort for which the medieval knight was deeply prepared, not by accident or luck, but by decades of intensive training that began long before he was considered fit for actual combat. The training of a medieval knight was one of the longest and most demanding journeys a human being could undertake at that time. It began in childhood, usually between 6 and 7 years of age, when the boy from a noble family was sent to serve in another aristocratic house as a page. In this first phase, besides the notions of courtly life, he began his progressive physical conditioning and his learning with the simplest weapons. Around 12 or 13, the page advanced to the status of squire, becoming the personal assistant to an experienced knight. Training intensified. The squire accompanied his lord on campaigns, learned to handle swords, spears, and shields, practiced advanced horsemanship, and gradually began to get used to the weight of metal protections, piece by piece, adapting his body to this second skin of iron so that his organism assimilated the changes progressively. This adaptation process had a solid physiological basis. Muscles strengthen in the specific directions of the effort required of them. Reflexes modify to incorporate the new dimensions that the equipment adds to the body. A squire who spent years moving with different pieces of armor on his body would develop specific musculature, an adapted sense of balance, and an intuitive understanding of how the extra weight affected every movement. When, finally, between 18 and 21, he was knighted in a solemn ceremony, He was no longer an ordinary man carrying an extraordinary weight. He was a specialist whose body had been molded for over a decade for that specific function. The most powerful evidence regarding the mobility of knights in armor comes not from abstract historical texts, but from practical experiments conducted by researchers in recent decades. In specialized museums and academic institutions throughout Europe and North America, volunteers donned faithful replicas of medieval armor and underwent rigorous physical tests. The results were consistently surprising to anyone who expected to confirm the popular image of the immobilized knight. The volunteers were able to get up from the ground without external help, both from a kneeling position and from lying completely flat. They could run at a reasonable speed, climb stairs, scale obstacles, and execute complex combat movements, twisting their torsos, crouching, and extending their arms in all directions. A study conducted by researchers at the University of Leeds measured the energy cost of walking and running in medieval plate armor. The result confirmed that moving in armor was more energetically costly than moving without it. But the main reason revealed something interesting. The additional cost was primarily due to the mass of the pieces covering the legs, making each step more costly due to the principle of inertia and not just the total weight of the set. This, in turn, shed light on something that historians had been observing in medieval records for a long time. The fact that knights in battle frequently fought on foot, not just mounted on their horses. There were moments when dismounting and fighting on the ground was not only viable, but strategically preferable for various tactical reasons. A knight who could not move at all could never fight on foot with any efficiency. But historical records show that this practice was common, and that in certain contexts, such as in the siege of castles or in marshy terrain where horses could not operate safely, it was the rule, not the exception. There is another particularly persistent myth: the idea that medieval knights needed to be hoisted onto their horses by means of winches or similar mechanisms. This image has appeared in films and books for decades, presented as an established fact, but it has no verifiable basis in historical records. No medieval manuscript, no illumination or tapestry depicting knights preparing for battle shows any mechanism of this type. On the contrary, medieval training manuals describe exercises in which knights in full armor mounted their horses without the use of stirrups, using only the strength of their arms and legs. The myth seems to have arisen from a confusion with tournament armor, which was indeed much heavier and more restrictive than field armor. Designed to withstand the impact of high-speed lances in a controlled situation, these specialized armors could weigh substantially more. Some mechanical device may have been used in these specific contexts, but to mistake this restricted practice for the everyday experience of a knight in real combat is a considerable historical error. To understand the truth about medieval armor in all its depth, it is also necessary to understand the extraordinary skill of the artisans who created them. The medieval armorer, the maker of armor by trade, was one of the most qualified and valued professionals of his time, an artisan whose knowledge combined high-level metallurgy, structural engineering, and a deep, practical understanding of human anatomy that anticipated formal modern ergonomic design practices by centuries. The major centers of armor production in medieval and Renaissance Europe were few, and for that very reason extraordinarily famous. Milan, in northern Italy, was perhaps the most renowned of all. Milanese armor was exported throughout Christian Europe and was considered the standard of excellence that all other armorers on the continent aspired to reach or at least approach. Families of Milanese armorers, such as the Missaglia and the Negroli, built reputations that lasted for entire generations and served a select clientele that included kings, dukes, emperors, and popes. Orders from other countries arrived in Milan through specialized commercial agents in a sophisticated international trade system for the time. Not far away, the city of Augsburg in present-day Germany was another polo of armor production of the first magnitude. German armorers developed their own style, German Gothic armor, with its pointed shapes, pronounced ridges, and meticulous finishing. The rivalries between the Italian and German schools were genuine and productive, driving technical and aesthetic innovation on both sides. The process of creating high-quality armor was long, complex, and required skills that took years to master with the necessary depth. It began with the careful selection and treatment of the metal. Steel of sufficient quality for real combat armor needed to be processed to achieve a specific balance of hardness and flexibility that tolerated no errors. Metal that was too hard could shatter catastrophically under the impact of a strong blow. Metal that was too soft would deform with unacceptable ease, compromising both protection and the shape of the piece. The correct balance was obtained through processes of controlled heating, systematic hammering, and tempering that armorers developed throughout their careers and guarded as professional secrets of extraordinary value. High-quality medieval armor was almost always custom-made. A king or duke who ordered his armor would send detailed measurements of his body to the armorer, or the artisan himself would travel to the court to take the measurements. Every curve was shaped to match the specific anatomy of the user, distributing weight efficiently and allowing for maximum mobility in every joint. The joints where the pieces met were especially challenging. A poorly designed joint created a vulnerable point. An excessively rigid joint limited movement. Armorers developed ingenious solutions, systems of overlapping lames, free-turning rivets, and internal leather straps that connected pieces and allowed movement in multiple planes. When examining these solutions, modern engineers frequently express admiration for the sophistication of the mechanical reasoning they imply. The Royal Armories in the United Kingdom, the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York house collections of original medieval armor of exceptional quality. Conservators and historians who work with these pieces describe an experience that no photograph fully conveys. Holding a 15th century suit of armor in one's hands is to realize, immediately and physically, that it is lighter than expected, more elegant in its construction than popular imagination suggests, and clearly conceived by minds that deeply understood the human body in motion. This understanding reflected an absolutely fundamental practical reality for the armor market. A knight, immobilized by his own armor, was on the battlefield a vulnerable knight. The medieval armor market, and it was indeed a sophisticated market, with specialized suppliers, demanding buyers, commercial agents, and formal contracts, would not tolerate for long products that rendered their users ineffective in situations of maximum demand. An armorer, whose production compromised mobility, and therefore the survival of his clients on the battlefield, would quickly lose his reputation, his clientele, and his livelihood. Market pressure, so to speak, ensured that medieval armorers remained eternally attentive to the issue of practical usability. Historical records clearly illuminate the reality of mobility in armor. The German fencing manuals known as Fechtbücher are, in this sense, sources of invaluable value. Created by masters of arms to document the combat techniques of their time, they include instructions on how to fight on foot in full armor, grappling techniques, unbalancing the opponent, and exploiting the vulnerable points of armor. These precise techniques would be completely useless if armored warriors were unable to move with the freedom necessary to apply them. The competitions and tournaments of martial skill that punctuated medieval aristocratic life offer another revealing window into the real mobility of knights in armor. Medieval tournaments evolved considerably over the centuries, from the relatively disorganized group battles of early times to the elaborate, highly regulated spectacles of the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. But in all their forms and in all periods of their existence, they required participants to demonstrate genuine and verifiable physical skill, mounting and controlling horses at high speed on precise trajectories, aiming and hitting moving targets with a lance or projectiles, absorbing the impact of powerful blows without being knocked down or unbalanced. None of these feats would be possible, even at a basic level, for someone effectively trapped inside a metal cage that allowed no movement. The medieval chronicles that have come down to us frequently record the physical exploits of famous knights in details that, when interpreted correctly, directly contradict the image of the immobilized warrior. Historical figures such as King Henry I of England, who personally fought at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 in full field armor, or John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, whose reputation as a personally brave warrior was a central part of his political identity, are described in contemporary sources as combatants of remarkable physical capacity, capable of sustaining the intense effort of combat for periods that impressed even those accustomed to the harshness of medieval warfare. Agincourt in October 1415 is an especially interesting case to examine in this specific context. The battle, fought between the English army of Henry V and numerically far superior French forces, is often cited as an example of the destructive power of English archers with their longbows. But it also illustrates something directly relevant to the mobility of medieval warriors. The French nobles and knights, dressed in their plate armor, advanced on foot through a field of heavy terrain, partly muddied by the rains that had fallen in previous days, toward the English positions. This advance on foot, in full armor through difficult terrain and over a considerable distance, is in itself powerful evidence that total immobility simply does not correspond to documented historical reality. At the same time, Agincourt also illustrates a real limitation of medieval armor: accumulated fatigue. Armor represented an additional load whose effects were felt progressively over hours of effort. This does not negate the initial mobility of the warriors, which was real and documented, but it confirms that physical endurance was a determining factor and that the distinction between what a knight could do at the beginning and the end of a prolonged combat was palpable. As the centuries passed, the role of armor began to change. The 15th century marked the technical and aesthetic pinnacle of plate armor, that moment when the best armorers produced works that were simultaneously instruments of war and works of art. But already in that same century, the seeds of the transformation that would make armor obsolete were being planted. Gunpowder, which had reached Europe around the 14th century, was progressively redefining the nature of war. The first firearms were primitive and slow to reload, coexisting for decades with traditional methods. But as the 16th century progressed, they improved in power and range. Against a musket projectile, even the most sophisticated plate armor had increasing limitations. Armorers responded by making certain regions thicker, and some 16th century armors displayed deliberate marks left by artisans as proof that the metal had been tested against firearms. But the race between offensive power and metal protection had an inevitable outcome. Throughout the 17th century, armor was progressively abandoned as standard equipment, with torso protection being the last to persist among the heavy cavalry of the period. What remained of these hundreds of years of development and refinement? The armor itself remained, preserved in the great museums of the world and in European palaces that still keep the pieces of their ancestors. The written records, military treatises, and training manuals documenting an extraordinarily sophisticated combat culture remained. And there remained, perhaps above all, the persistent fascination that the medieval period exerts on the human imagination. It speaks of an era when the individual skill of a warrior could change the course of historical events, where craftsmanship was inseparable from effectiveness on the battlefield. A fascination that deepens when we replace the image of the immobilized knight with the historically accurate image. A highly conditioned warrior, equipped with one of the most sophisticated technological creations of his time. Finally, it is impossible not to mention the significant role that popular culture, and particularly cinema and television, played in perpetuating myths about medieval armor. From the early swashbuckling films of the early 20th century to the spectacular productions of recent decades, the image of the heavy, rigid, and clumsy knight has been repeated with remarkable consistency. And there are understandable, if historically unsatisfactory, reasons for this. A warrior who moves with visible difficulty is, in terms of simplified visual narrative, more immediately readable as someone burdened. Historical fiction often prefers the symbol to precision. But the price of these narrative choices is a persistent deformation of the historical record, a deformation that, through its recurrence in the media with the greatest popular reach, ended up convincing entire generations of a fact that specialists know does not correspond to reality. The real story, that of skilled warriors using sophisticated equipment created by extraordinary artisans within the limitations and possibilities of their time, is dramatically more interesting than any simplifying myth. It is the story of human beings solving complex problems with intelligence, of a race between attack and defense that lasted centuries, of a martial culture that valued individual skill and technical knowledge as much as the equipment itself. It is also the story of how much we can learn about the past when we are willing to look closely beyond the images that repetition has made familiar to the point of appearing natural. Medieval armor was not a metal prison. It was an instrument of a very specific purpose, developed with intelligence and skill over generations by artisans who deeply understood both the mechanics of combat and human anatomy and physiology, used by men who spent decades of their lives learning to move within them with fluency, efficiency, and a naturalness that surprises those who have not been exposed to historical reality. Understanding this in no way diminishes the fascination that these extraordinary pieces exert on those who see them and those who study the period that produced them. On the contrary, it deepens that fascination by replacing a two-dimensional and simplified image with a three-dimensional reality, rich in nuance, technical detail, and humanity. The history of medieval armor is, ultimately, the story of one of humanity's most enduring and revealing efforts, protecting the human body from the dangers of the world without sacrificing the ability to act within it with fullness and efficiency. When we look at a medieval suit of armor in a museum, we can now look with different eyes, not as if at a curious relic of an era of clumsiness, but as if at the product of applied human intelligence with dedication and skill to an urgent and real problem, with results that even today, centuries after their time, invite us to re-examine what we think we know about the past and the people who inhabited it. Because history, like medieval armor itself, is often lighter and more agile than we imagine, and it is always richer, more complex, and more fascinating than the myths we build in its place to simplify what we do not fully understand. If this exploration of the world of medieval armor has awakened in you the same curiosity that moves all those dedicated to uncovering the truths hidden beneath the surface of history, then you already know what to do. This channel is your next step. Each video is an invitation to question what is assumed to be true and to find the richer reality that lies beyond familiar images. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next investigations. Like this video if it changed something in the way you see the past. And tell us in the comments which detail surprised you the most, because the best historical discoveries, after all, are always those we share.